fertilizer were so high because of poor transport and the like, poor markets for outputs and so on? Or was it high T costs, high transactions costs, as famously argued by the group to which Colin belonged to, the Y College group, which wrote a series of powerful articles from the mid-90s onwards, arguing that it was high transaction costs, the costs of information, that was blocking the development of factor markets. And we've had quite a long period of academic discussion over which of these is the more important, and therefore what are the best policy responses. But times change. And since round about 2003, we have an Africa of rising optimism. So let's remind ourselves why we are so much more optimistic today than we were in the early 1990s, why those statements from the early 1990s are now ridiculous. The magic slide has clicked on, and there's our first reason. Commodity prices have moved upwards in the second half of the 2000s in ways that would have been astonishing. These are commodity price indices. We've got the green one is food and beverages, the yellow one is the non-food cash crops. There they are throughout the first half of the 2000s on an index. Then we get this tremendous spike in 2007, 2008, subsequent spikes. There's a very curious low there. I'm not quite sure what it is. Colin's going to tell me it's something to do with cotton. But by the time we get here, even these non-food cash crops, they're all looking good. The commodity prices have moved up, on international markets. All of our farm output prices have jagged up. There's so much better possibilities now for farmers to earn money. And then the open goal which faces Africa. This is from 1990 onwards, and here we're looking at the quantity that Asia, principally of course China and India, have imported in vegetable oils and oilseeds. And look at this graph here. It's just an astonishing increase. This one here is oilseed. This is soybeans to China. Soybeans both for oil and for food for pigs and chickens. And these are vegetable oil imports to all countries in Asia, but particularly India. For some reason, India's green revolution performed poorly for oilseeds and mounting imports. I mean, Asia is the open goal in the world at the moment for exporters of agricultural produce. This one here has largely been serviced by Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, and other Latin American countries who've seized on that opportunity. The question we're all asking ourselves is, the Indian Ocean isn't that wide for Eastern and Southern Africa. This has to be a major market, yes? It's a huge opportunity. Then the other reasons to be cheerful. The rising rate of economic growth. This is a study published a couple of years ago looking at the per capita growth rate in economies of Africa, roughly 0% per capita growth from 1979 to 1995, but since 1996 to 2008, 3.2, oh my goodness, it's that 3.2% per capita. Well, that's obviously impossible, but that happened for the whole economy. Those rates are rising, that's to 08. If we ran it to 2013, that would move up from 3.2%. The dark blue on here are 17 countries picked out at the time as having particularly fast growth rates. And again, if we updated that map, some of the lighter blue, which are the next fastest growing, would have moved into the fast growing category. And it's an astonishing map. It's a good chunk of Africa where we're now seeing very fast growth rates. Let's just pop that back again. Yeah, I mean, it's, Eastern and Southern Africa and a swathe of West Africa, particularly in this axis through Ghana, Burkina, and Mali on these particular statistics we're looking at here. So a revival of economic growth, a lot of discussion about the nature of that economic growth, discussion which is being led here in Ghana through the Africa Centre for Economic Transformation, ACET, who published this year the Africa Transformation Report, the first ever Africa Transformation Report, which says we've got lots of growth in Africa, but is it transformative growth? Yes? Is it raising productivity, diversifying economies, and delivering the kind of development that we want? Policy has got a lot better in the 2000s. Now these are these net rates of assistance, this time not for the whole continent. There's 10 countries, and if you're saying which 10 countries are those, these are the 10 countries signed up to the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. What you can see here, it does include Ghana. Ghana is here. What you can see from 70 to 85 is that most of these net rates of assistance are heavily negative, with our worst case being Tanzania here, which is almost minus 50% as an average for those years. So there it is for the 1970s to 85, and here it is in the 2000s, the red columns, and as you can see, the degree of discrimination, prejudice against Africa, taxation against agriculture has been reduced, and in some cases you've even got positive discrimination for agriculture, and that's what the case of Mozambique, where we've actually got a positive discrimination. But in many cases now, the degree of taxation of agriculture is less than 10%. In fact, the only one that has more than 10% is the case of the Côte d'Ivoire. And I don't know enough about the Côte d'Ivoire to explain that. Here's another reason to be cheerful. Abundant land. In 2009, a study was completed by the World Bank called Africa's Sleeping Giant. And what this said was that in the Guinea Savannah, the areas in grey here, the Guinea Savannah, there were 600 million hectares of underused land, medium potential land ripe for development. And the inspiration that they took from this was the Cerrado of northeast Brazil and northeast Thailand, which are both export powerhouses in the world based on medium potential land, with the application of specialized technology to use those resources and the investments in the infrastructure to get the produce out of those particular areas. And when you put those glasses on and you look at Africa, then of course we have this enormous area. Now, north of Ghana, when you're looking from Accra, we tend to say, oh my goodness, this is lower potential. Well, it is compared to the forest belt, but it's still medium potential land with huge possibilities in it. And so all of this middle belt here that we're looking at, and it is many hundreds of millions of hectares, the argument was there is huge vent for surplus in a world, this publication was in 2009, in which commodity prices have just taken this big jump up. Huge potential for Africa to do that. And then lastly, Africa back on the political agenda. And as you know better than I do, the Maputo Declaration of 2003, a growth target of 6% per year, an investment target of 10% of public budgets for agriculture. We have the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Programme since 2003, initially from NEPAD, now under African Union aegis, as a major Africa-led agricultural development programme. And we have efforts like Accra, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, lots and lots of money from foundations, principally the Gates Foundation, for a renewed emphasis on food production in Africa. And regional economic integration, how quickly is it going? It's always going less quickly than anybody would hope, but it is going. It is moving. There are certainly signs that the great promise of regional economic integration will start to see the fruits of that. I know Eastern Africa better in this case, and we're now seeing trading links taking place in Eastern and Southern Africa, which 15 years ago simply wouldn't have happened. Okay, well that's a view of the history. So let me just give you 3 or 4 slides now that says, well, okay, against that background of history, what's happened in the last 20 years on African agriculture? And the first thing I want to do is to revise that very gloomy graph that we saw for food production in the world from the 1960s through to the end of the 1970s. And we're going to rebase the indices now to the early 1980s, to what you can call in some ways almost a rebirth of African agriculture. And we're going to look at it from the 1980s through to the current period. And we're going to look at Africa, and we're going to look at its constituent parts. Well, look, our first one, this is an Africa-wide index, yeah? Now, I've grown tired. I'm a journal editor, amongst other things. I've grown tired of reading introductions to articles about African agriculture that tell me in the year 2014 that the production per head of food in Africa is low, it's less than it was, and it's going down. I can't find this in any statistics I care to look at anywhere. It's going up. Okay, it ain't going up terrifically, but it's more than 20% more. So progress has been made in the last 20 years. If you read stuff about food production going down per capita, then it's clearly a sad national case, or perhaps it's one of the lagging regions. So let's have a look at some of the regional constituents. And the way the machine's done it is, which is our first candidate up here? This is Eastern Africa. Now the interesting thing for Eastern Africa is it continues to go down throughout the 1980s, but it has been rising since then. So Eastern Africa, yeah, it is less than it was 20 years ago, but that's because Eastern Africa continued to have bad times with its agriculture. Bad times in the 1990s, improvement since. And the last one, last and not least, given who's in the room, there's West Africa. Now, the interesting thing about West Africa is that West Africa, all the way through to the early 2000s, is the star performer. I know some of you may be looking at this and saying, I can't believe it. Now, let's just have a look at the growth of agricultural production. That was food production per capita. Wow. How is this going? Yeah. Okay, that's African agricultural production from the early 1990s to recently. This is total agricultural growth run as an annual equivalent growth rate. Yeah? Now this one over here is Africa as a whole. And I want you to look at what that African agricultural growth rate is since 1990. Anybody want to guess what that number is from just looking? It's 3.2. It's absolutely amazing. That, of course, in 1990 was clearly impossible. Yeah? Clearly impossible. Now, you know, today a lot of you in the room will be saying, well, you know, shut up, mate, 3.2, that's not great. We've got a card up target of 6%. 3.2 is nothing. But I just want to remind you of history, you know, the times of pessimism when 3.2 was clearly impossible. Now, within Africa, some regions have done better, and outstanding regions here are Northwest. East Africa comes through here as well. This is what happens if you look at these production indices per capita. Now, in all cases, per capita, Africa has been going ahead, except for Middle or Central Africa. Yeah? And when you think about the travails of the Democratic Republic of Congo, you can imagine why that statistic is not great. Interestingly, on these, if you divide this period between 1990 to 2000 and 2000 since, what you find is the star performers of the 1990s, North and West, have fallen back a little, and those parts of Africa that weren't doing as well, East, Southern and Middle, have improved. So there's been a convergence of growth rates, which is kind of good news. Now, last couple of slides. Those are production, yeah? And what most people will tell you is, well, that's not transformation, that's just production. They've added a whole bunch of fields and they haven't done anything to productivity. So let's have a couple of slides which look at productivity. And what we're going to be looking at here is this is, for Africa and its regions, what we're going to look at here is production per hectare. So it's magically come up there. There's output per hectare in value terms across Africa. Now the central figure there is just over $500 worth of output per hectare at that time. It's true. You can see it's better for Northern Africa, it's better for Southern Africa, but there's not a huge amount of regional variation. What does it look like at the end of the 20 years? Well, there are the red columns. Everywhere it's increased. So anybody who tells you yields are not rising, no, sorry, yields are rising. We're getting more per hectare than we did in the past. And if you want to get some kind of sense of what the percentage increase has been over this period, dark blocks there show you what they are. You'll see for the whole of Africa, it's somewhere between 45 and 50% more. For most of the regions, it's 40% or more, and for the best of the cases, Northern Africa, it's about 65% more over a 20-year period. It's not spectacular improvement in productivity, but it is improvement, yeah? So that's land productivity, and if we do the same for labor, that's labor productivity in 1990. Production per person, well, you can see here for the whole of Africa, it's something like 750 per person here. There's a huge exception with Southern Africa. Southern Africa, by the way, is totally dominated by the Republic of South Africa. These are UN definitions of Southern Africa. This is effectively SACU. And, of course, the South African one is about $4,000 per hectare. Northern Africa is notably higher than the average. What does it look like 20 years later? Well, there it is 20 years later. Everywhere it's increased, although in some cases the increases are fairly small. And the diamonds, which the triangles which have appeared there are the percentage increases. And what you can see is for the whole of Africa, it's round about 25% more per person employed in agriculture. It varies quite a lot by country. Eastern Africa has the lowest of 10%, and the very highest there is in Northern Africa of about 60%. Now, those increases in labor productivity, they're not great over 20 years, yeah? But they're all in the right direction. Okay, last slide. What do we conclude about this? Well, there's the story. The story of the last 20 years, glass half full, glass half empty. Wild optimists are not right, wild pessimists are also not right. So, half empty, there's plenty of room for improvement on agricultural production and productivity, but things are moving in the right direction. There's an enormous amount of variation across countries, and I take that to mean that there are a lot of lessons to be learned for countries in Africa from neighboring countries in Africa. You don't have to run to Asia to see the lessons. Although if you do run to Asia, please learn the right lessons from Asia. But then we can have a big fight over the right lessons, and I'll tell you now, rather than leaving it just hanging there, for me, the big lessons from Asia are transformation in Asia thanks to 30 or 40 years of consistency and persistence, yeah? Nothing happened in Asia overnight, yeah? All the great Asian stories, starting with China, but Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, parts of India and so on, these are 30 or 40-year histories of pretty consistent direction on strategy and policy. It certainly wasn't done overnight. So, yeah, that's what I think are the right lessons. And there we go. That sets the scene.